Well, good morning. Thanks for joining me on Tuesday. Took a long weekend, and I thank you for coming back with me on Tuesday. We're still working through Hebrews chapter 11. This is our Hall of Fame. We're also calling it the Hall of Faith. We're looking at individuals that lived lives of faith. They were not perfect individuals. The only one we believe that is perfect was Jesus Christ. So we can look at these individuals, see their good points, see their struggles, and see how they continue to walk in faith. We spent a lot of time in the Old Testament because those are the ones that we have that the author of Hebrews wrote about. So as we go into Hebrews chapter 11, we're going to be focusing on verse 21 today. So I'm going to give you a chance to find that as we do a review. We've been reviewing these individuals that were successfully. Let me try it again. We were looking at these individuals who were extremely successful. There we go. In their area of faith. We are looking at Abel. Abel reminded us that we need to approach God by his standards. We looked at the life of Enoch and that we need to walk in obedience and faith with God. Enoch walked into heaven literally. He never experienced death. Abraham was willing to follow God even though he did not know the destination that he was going to. Sarah, she had faith in God's promises even when the situation seemed impossible. And Isaac, he had conflict, and conflict can lead to blessings when there's repentance that is involved. So by now you should be in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 21. We're going to talk about the person of Jacob. Now, we're in Hebrews chapter 11, but I'm going to take you back to Genesis again. Genesis chapter 48. So if you want to cross reference and go back to Genesis 48, I'm going to get there in about 30 seconds to a minute. Let's do a review. You see, God gave Abraham a promise. That promise to Abraham is found in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. The promise was land, seed, and blessing. I'm going to give you land. I'm going to give you a lot of kids, and those that bless you, I'm going to bless, and those that curse you, I'm going to curse. You see, this promise was transferred to Isaac, and then it was transferred to Jacob because it was a promise given to the family of Abraham, not just an individual. Now we know Jacob, and if you've been in Sunday school, you've heard many stories of Jacob. Now Jacob's name was changed to Israel because Jacob at that point wrestled with God and he would not let go of God until God blessed him. So the angel went and touched his socket and changed his name. His name was changed to Israel. Now Israel or Jacob, same person, just that name change. He had 12 sons, and they became the 12 tribes or the 12 sons of Jacob, or we know them today as the 12 sons or the 12 tribes of Israel because of that name change. Now, fast forward a few years, and now we're going to focus on Jacob or Israel's death, not the nation of Israel, the person of Israel, Jacob's death. Today we're focusing on Jacob, his family. Jacob's family, he had those 12 sons. Now, out of those 12 sons, he had one son. That son's name was Joseph. Now, Joseph, he was the one that had the coat of many colors, and his other brothers were extremely jealous of Joseph, so they sold him into slavery, and Joseph ended up going to Egypt, and he ended up going into prison, and then he walked out of prison, and he became the second in command under Pharaoh during a time of famine. Now, Jacob is over in the promised land that was promised to his grandfather Abraham, and he's living in that land. Now, that land is having a great famine, and they don't have enough food, so they have to go to Egypt because they hear of all this food that has been stored up. And so the whole family goes over to Egypt, and long and behold, who do they find? They find Joseph. All right, so that's the story. That's basically from Genesis chapter 15, 16, 17, 18, the whole way through the end of the book of Genesis. So let's go to Genesis chapter 48. I'm going to be looking at verses 1 through 6. Camp here the rest of the day, looking at the faith of Jacob. At this point in Genesis 48, Jacob is dying. He had lived a long life on earth, but it is now his time to pass away. He is going to die. Now, Jacob, he blessed both of Joseph's sons. While Joseph was in Egypt, he got married. He has two sons. Jacob is going to bless those sons or his grandchildren, even though they were born in a foreign land, which was Egypt. They received the inheritance of the land and the blessing that Jacob passed on to them. Again, Jacob is dying. With his last breath, he decides to worship the Lord. He wants to continue to worship God, even though Jacob has not seen the promises of God fulfilled. Because of the famine, because of the difficulties that Jacob has experienced, he has had to move his family out of the promised land and into a foreign land. And that's where they're going to stay until Moses comes and he removes them from Egypt and puts them back into the promised land. That's how the Israelites, the children of Israel, the sons of Jacob, got from Israel to Egypt because of the famine. So we see the promises that God has given to Jacob, they have actually went in the reverse order, because Jacob is now not receiving the blessings or receiving the promises of God because he's living in a foreign land that's not his own, but he's seeing his children have children and their children have children. And we're seeing that Jacob is worshiping God because he knows that God will keep his promises. And Jacob is worshiping God, and he wanted his children and his grandchildren to live knowing God keeps his promises. Now, Jacob is not going to live long enough to see his children return to the promised land. But Jacob worships God in faith. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Jacob, with his last breath, he is the one that is going to be worshiping God because he knows God will keep his promises. Even if Jacob does not live to see him, Jacob wants his children, his grandchildren, and his great grandchildren to live in the promises of God. How about you and me? What does that look like on a Tuesday morning for us? Do we worship God only when we see the promises of God in our lifetime? Hey, I'm only going to worship God when God does what I want when I want it done. Or do we remember that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things that are not seen? Are you worshiping God because you know he will fulfill his promises? Or do you worship God only when you see the promises fulfilled in your lifetime? Are you living in an attitude of faith and worshiping in faith? What a great challenge from Jacob. For us to worship God when we have seen the promises and also when we have faith knowing that God will fulfill the promises. Oftentimes, God does not work in our time frame, but God always keeps his promises, whether we see them or whether we don't see them in our lifetime. What a great reminder for Jacob. The last breath, he's worshiping God because he knows God will keep his promise. I hope that that's a challenge for you. I hope that you continue to worship God knowing that he will fulfill his promise when it is his good, perfect, and pleasing will. If I can help you in any way, I trust you'll reach out and that you'll have a great Tuesday. I'll see you back here tomorrow morning for another day in the Hall of Faith.